And with this, let's get started, and let's hear from the one and only Doug Jacobs.
Good morning. It is great to be back in Blairstown. I have a history with Blairstown in that a guy who crewed for me for years and years, certainly through the most successful racing period that I had, was Bob Fitch, your own Bob Fitch. Pete's dad, Gene, was there as well. There's a glider out there that was mine that I sold to Bob, and he sold to Gene, who sold it to Pete, I think. So Bravo Foxtrot is proud resident here. But I've got a warm spot in my heart for this area, and just happy to be here. My wife says I mumble, so if you're hearing me mumble, stick your hand, throw something, whatever, and I'll try to speak up or speak more clearly. Everybody hear me okay? That probably won't last. My topic today is decision making. And why decision making? Well, you know, you think about why on a racing scene some pilots always seem to do better or win and some pilots don't. What's the difference? What makes one pilot more consistently a winner than another? I'm going to have to put on my glasses to read my notes, of course. Getting old is not helpful, by the way. I'll be a little bit controversial and talk about the differences here. I don't really think there are super material differences in pilot skills. Kind of at the top 25%, and there's a number of them in the room here, percent of the racers that you go up against. I don't believe that most pilots can out-thermal other pilots. I don't believe that other pilots can, you know, fly straighter in the sense of the yaw string than another, or you know, certainly you can be more aggressive with your speed, and newer pilots tend to fly too slow. But once you kind of get that trick, you're all kind of flying the same speed between thermals. You're all kind of thermaling in the same way. The ships don't really make all that much difference, I got to say. Sorry, George Moffett. Sorry, those guys of you who just bought your Ventus 3. They do make a difference, there's no question about that. Newer ships, more modern ships are better. But, you know, you're almost talking about the kinds of differences between, say, the top 20 ships in a big contest that you'd lose if you turned the wrong way in the next thermal. You know, you'd offset that much of an advantage that the ship gave you by just making that decision the wrong way. Now, I've got a lot of arguments on this from a lot of people, because, particularly from sailplane dealers. I think on the aggressiveness side, sure, there is difference in aggressiveness between pilots. And remember, we're in a sort of an optimization sport, right? You're trying to get up the curve, risk-reward curve, out the risk curve, up the reward curve, and it kind of goes like this, but then it flattens out, and it gets real flat right at the optimal level, and then it falls off flat because you land in the field. So that's a really tough decision. So aggressiveness is, you know, a kind of a two-edged sword, differences between pilots. And you find that as a result, at least at the world stage, it's almost, there's an optimum age band. And Mike and I and Carl and others here who have kind of been in that world kind of reflect it. Kind of in the late 30s, early 40s is when you're really kind of optimal, because you've kind of lost some of the hair-on fires of the Daniel world. You know, the young guys who really want to go out there and do it, and you've landed in enough fields to know you need to slow down a little bit, but you haven't slowed down so much that the younger guys pass you by when the weather is good. So you look at all those differences and you say, well, it's not thermaling technique necessarily. It's not, can I fly straight between thermals? It's not my aggressiveness. My ship matters, but it doesn't matter hugely. What really is the difference that keeps people on top of their game? And it's a spoiler alert here. It's decision making, I think. This is my theory. I'm not sure how many people will sign up for it, but let me go through it and see if I can convince you. So there's a lot going on in a soaring flight. Now let's talk about, you know, just around the field, but also basic cross country. And if you start thinking about all the things you're doing during a soaring flight. You are trying to thermal optimally. What I just said, you just have to watch that all the time. Justin Wills once told me that every time he talks on the radio, he loses 100 feet in the thermal. I mean, you have to concentrate that clearly because you're making a mental picture of what is around you that includes a bunch of other things that might hit you. And so you have to stay out of their way, and safety is an important, important feature. So you're thinking about what size is the thermal, should I tighten up my bank, should I loosen up my bank, how about that other person, what is he or she doing in terms of their thermaling technique. How high should I take this thermal? We all know that they're not the same from the ground to the top. Some of them get stronger, some of them get weaker. They typically get weaker as you get higher, but sometimes they get stronger. So how much more should I take before going on to the next one? Where do I go next, right? I'm really highly focused locally when you're thermaling. You're just right here and in the moment thinking about all the things we've covered so far. But at some point I got to say, where am I going next when I get to the top? So when I get to the top, I don't say, gee, which way is west? What path to get there? It's not just flying directly, but as you'll hear from some of the other presenters, energy paths, shear lines, whatever, are very, very important. Cloud lines, if you can put together a bunch of puffies out there and turn them into a cloud street, you're ahead of the game. So you have to be thinking about that as you're climbing up. And what else here? Must be other things. Why isn't this going, Daniel?
Nope. Let's extend it.
Did I hit something?
Let's see what's going on here. There you go. There you go.
So, my thesis here is that cross-country soaring is as much about decision-making as about flying the glider. And then when you add in racing, you get a whole different, another layer, if you will, of complexity. Raise your hand if you've been in a thermal with 10 gliders. Raise your hand if you've been in a thermal with 20 gliders. Raise your hand if you've been in a thermal with 30 gliders. Come on. I think I got 140 and that scared the hell out of me. So I'll go for it. But all of you guys who had your hands up, all you folks that had your hands up, know how tense and how stressful that really is. So you're doing all the stuff we've been talking about so far, but you're doing a lot more because you're racing, and there's a whole lot more people around you. When are you going to start? Certainly when you start your race is critical in terms of your performance for the day. You're looking at that optimal time in the day as the thermals increase and decrease, adjusted for when the front comes through and everything else that happens. You got to figure out when to start. So you're thinking about that. What your starting strategies are, and these have gotten a lot more complicated. It used to be that you bomb through a gate. How many people went through a start gate in their careers? Those were fun, weren't they? You get about 1,000 feet above somewhere out here, and you just blast down, and you got to get below, what is it, 3,000, 1,000 meters, 3,000, something like that. And then you pull back up and get the energy back again. Now it's a whole lot more complicated. You can actually start from the back of a cylinder. Okay, there's a cylinder. You start from the side, you start from the front, you can start from the back, you can start through the top. Lots of decision variables there, and they all make sense given different circumstances. But you're thinking about it the whole time. You're going to fool the flight computer. Smartest guy I know in soaring. Daniel, I'm sorry, but I think John Cochran may be a scoop smarter than you. And I saw him, you know who John Cochran is. He's a fellow at Stanford. Stanford Institute, I think he was a University of Chicago professor, maybe he's going back there. Written extensively and highly quantitative approach to soaring. He was sitting with the manual for an LX, I don't know, LX 3000, whatever the latest LX is, in this borrowed ship that he had in Minden a couple of years ago, the day before the Nationals began. And he was throwing it on the ground and screaming because it was so complicated. You can have your choice of computers. There's a lot of different approaches. I happen to fly with a ClearNav, and I like it a lot. But there's a lot of energy and decision making that goes into just managing your computer. And they're indispensable to doing well. You just can't wing it anymore. You have to understand the numbers and use your computer effectively. All right, then there's the tasks themselves. You know, where are you going to go next on the map? Usually you have a first turn that you have to go to, or maybe two turns. And then it's up to you to go wherever you want. Now, decision making is at a minimum for a classic speed task. You know, A, B, C, and come home, right? and when to start, and all those are still in the decision mix, but it's a whole lot easier because you know exactly where you're going. It's kind of to a point. With a mat, it's to a point, but a whole bunch of points can come next. And why would you go one way or another? Weather looks good. Carl Streetek went that way, so I'm going that way. Whatever, you know. But there's a lot of deciding in there. And then finally, with the AATs, these are really complicated soaring tests. For those of you who haven't flown one, you're basically assigned an area, and maybe a circle with 10, 20-mile radius, so it's a very big area. And your course to one side versus the other is quite different. The purpose of the task, of course, is to break up a big soaring field so that people make different decisions and there's not as much gaggling and it's a much more safe race, but it's also a whole lot more complex because you've got to figure out which part of a circle to go through. You've got to anticipate when to turn in it, meaning how much of the rest, how long will it take you to get around the rest of the course, and the rest of the course is variable as to size too, because you might be going to 2 or 3 different circles. And guess what? The circles you're not in, oftentimes you can't see the weather from where you are. If you're in the first circle and you've got to go to a second and third, oftentimes the third one is so far away that you can't see the weather, and so you have no idea whether it's good there, bad there, and whether you should go there early or stay away from it and go there late. Lots to think about. And then final glides are always fun. You know, should you go start a little low because you see a street out ahead and risk the idea of landing because it didn't really work, but you had a big advantage because you kind of bumped up onto your glide slope. Should you climb 1,000 feet over and be sure you get home, all of those sorts of things. So, cross country, but also racing is primarily a mental performance sport. There's all these things to think about. And you have to think about it under stress. You're up in the air. There's gliders all around you. You're getting shaken by the weather. You have to think about all of these decisions to make. And you're optimizing, you're in an optimization game where there's no clear right or wrong answer most of the time. Mostly it's a little bit more or a little bit less. Anybody want to argue with me so far? Don't buy this. You have to figure it out, you have to make sure it works for you as well. So, what do you do about all this? Complex mental workload. When the canopy comes down, that's the last factor. I remember Walter Covey, he's out of soaring now, it was a long time ago, but he was an airline pilot, funny guy. And he would say, don't make me think and fly at the same time. Because, you put the canopy down and you don't think as well as you and I sitting here thinking about this problem today. How do you deal with the complexity? I think the first important thing is to recognize you're in a very complex environment, very complicated decision-making environment. I mean, anything more than just, and there's nothing wrong with this, just thermaling around the field on a pleasant Sunday afternoon, not going anywhere. You get much more into cross-country and certainly into racing, you're in a very complex environment. But you have to recognize its elements. I think you want to minimize, you want to subtract everything you can. You want anything that you can get out of the way beforehand to be out of the way so that you concentrate on what you do need to think about during the flight and make decisions accordingly. What's that? Practicing the required actions is another way of minimizing distractions. If you're thinking about basic flight operations or preparation or whatever while you're in flight, it's going to complicate your decision-making environment. And I think at the end of the day, you have to sit down and think about your flights afterward and say, what did I do right and what did I do wrong? Even if you won the day or even if you landed out in the field, you did something right and you did something wrong in all of those flights. And they were related to decision making. Why did you make the decisions you did? Why did the other folks, if you know or if you can ask them, make decisions different from you? Why were they successful or less successful than the ones you knew? And I think that's important to get the feedback. Subtract the distractions. You can make your own list here, but basic ship handling. You really have to have all basic ship handling down absolutely automatically. Don't want to have to think about it. Not to think about how do I turn, do I more rudder, less rudder. You're just subtract that because it's absolutely automatic, and that comes from lots and lots of practice. So if you've got something to do on the ground on a weekday, put it away and go out and fly, particularly on the weekdays. You want to be up there so that everything is absolutely automatic, and you can come up with a plan. Mike is going to talk about mountain soaring. There's a terrific book that he had under his arm called Segeln über den Alpen by von Kalkbruch. He's a German writer who had very extensive experience in the Alps. And I got it when I first moved over to Switzerland in the late 70s and got to fly over there. Fortunately, it was a wonderful experience. But I got it and read it, and it helped my German as well, because I had to translate it as I went. And I remember him talking about thermaling into wave through rotors, right? And if you've done that, you know it's a pretty exciting experience. But it's also one in which you've got to get absolutely up on your ear. You can't thermal into a rotor on a 20-degree bank. If you can do that, it's not a rotor. Rotors are really small, and they're wicked turbulent. So he said the thing you need to do is go out, and I can't remember whether the number was, Mike could look it up. Either you got out there and be able to enter and exit a turn and make a 16 or 17 second circle over and over again. And it's like almost a 50-degree bank. And you go into it, take it, come out of it, and if you can keep the speed needle right where it needs to be, even in calm air, that's a start, but if you can do it in turbulent air, that's really worth it. That's one of many techniques I think you can practice and practice and practice on the ground that you probably not use in a race, but because you can do that, you can do things less challenging than that, almost automatically. So think of things that you can do to practice. You have to know your electronics cold. There is no worse feeling in the world than hitting the wrong button and you can't get back to the radio frequency. Because I don't know where your rate is. My rate is always down there somewhere. I can just barely see it around the stick anyway, or my tummy, one of the two. And you have an awful lot of trouble with that if you're fiddling around trying to fix it. Even worse is the flight computer, and we talked about that a minute ago. Unless it's pretty much automatic for you when to change a task, when to change a variable, how to put in a decision height, all of the things, the basic things you might need to do during the race. It's going to take time and attention away from your flying, away from your decision making, if you have to fool with it during the flight. And you want to avoid any unnecessary distractions. I mentioned Justin Will with the radio. I turn the radio off. I don't fly with the radio on when I race. Now I know those of you who've CD'd would criticize me because you're supposed to monitor the guard frequency and be able to warn people about stuff or be warned about stuff, and those are good things. But I just find it too damn distracting. And I'll tell you a story on Carl. One of my first races was in Elmira, standard class way back when, and we got sent out to the east somewhere, and he was out there ahead. I didn't know he was there, I guess. But at any rate, he landed. It was a week. Everybody's going to land out. He landed out. So I'm over his field with maybe 1,500 feet. I mean, I'm not desperate yet. I can still look around a little bit. And he calls up. He didn't know me, and I didn't really know him at the time. I knew of him, of course. He said, "Hey, Red Tail LaBelle," because I bought a LaBelle in Switzerland, had a red cross on the tail of it, and brought it back into the States. "Hey, Red Tail LaBelle." So, yeah. He said, "Yeah, if you're going to land this is the way you approach down here, turn left to the apple tree, you come in and watch this rock over here." Before you know, he reached up and pulled me right out of the sky. It was amazing. I sat on the ground saying, "How did I land here?" Well, I had a great conversation with him afterwards. But the radio can really mess you up. Obviously, physical comfort, and there's been a lot of discussion about excessive emotion. Angry, tense, upset pilots don't do well. They really just don't. And I think Brian Spreckley said it best in one of the Running on Empty films, where he said, I try to fly in as relaxed a manner as possible. I'm just having a good time. And who was the great Australian pilot from Germany? Ingo Reno said something about, I don't beat everybody else. The other pilots let me win. just a really relaxed attitude that seemed to help him. And I think it helps with the decision making we've been talking about. So subtract the distractions. prepare everything he possibly can. That flight computer should be programmed with all the tasks. Every once in a while, one of the times I was a CD, I've only been a CD twice, both were disasters. The second time, as Jim knows, we was down in Virginia, and I called 3 tasks on the sheet, and we actually flew the 4th task. We announced A at the pilots meeting, B on the line, C in the air, and canceled it and went to D by, radioing up to everybody to put a new task into there. I could hear them swearing from the ground. But that'll happen, and so you have to be, again, ready to not only do it, but also to have any other information in there already. You want to really sit down and look at the tasks beforehand, particularly AATs, particularly area tasks, and think through, what if I wanted to go hard left or hard right? What if I wanted to go deep into the second cylinder or the first cylinder? What are the terrain features? What is the typical weather in those areas that would make me do this, that, or that? But what will it look like as I'm going to the last circle and thinking about flying home? What's my sun angle? What's the wind likely to be doing at that time of day? And so how can I cut through and pick up the final glide by going through that third turn point? You want to have, obviously, ground crew arrangements made. This is easy for me to say. I did join the dark side last year. I bought something with a motor in the back. I love it. So it's less of an issue for me. But you can screw up all kinds of ways. I think, Mike, you were there were you there in Sweden when this was a practice day where I realized that my keys to the car, the crew car, were in my pocket. And we hadn't started the task yet, but there's a long launch line. I really didn't want to land and get to the back of the launch line and start over again. So I rated it down to Bob Fitch. I said, Bob, this is what I'm thinking of doing. I'm wrapping tape around my keys with a long streamer so it's really visible, and I'm describing this. And he said, okay, I'll look, And then I said to my teammates, we're all on the same frequency, if anybody thinks this is a bad idea, would you tell me now? And Ray comes out and says, I can't wait to see what happens next. He dropped them. He said, Bob, see the keys? Negative. Fortunately, some Swedes were close by and they saw them and picked them up, so that actually worked. Checklists, you've heard a lot about checklists from everybody, but also in racing, a checklist is really important, not for safety so much. It is, it's very important for safety, but it's also important for decision making so that you've cleared your mind of things that you might have to make a decision about. What else have we got to do to subtract the distractions? Physiological factors, very important. I think you want to be in as good shape as you can. Now that's tough coming from a 71-year-old speaker up here, but try to get out there and try to get as much exercise as you can. I think that'll help with your physical comfort and your decision making. Be well rested, of course. Stay away from the booze. Somebody to eat. It is really important to eat during the flight, I think. I learned this when they started coming out with these little energy bars. Boy, it really makes a difference in the back half of the flight. And you really need it a lot when you're making decisions at the end of the flight around final glides, last turn point, etc. So it really helps. Plenty to drink, of course, no question about that. You want dehydration. Positive mental attitude, self-confident, as we said, and a calm emotional outlook. Oh, yeah, that's what I wanted. One of the points I don't know how to go backward. That last point was the ability to put mistakes behind you. What happened to you yesterday will kill you today if you let it, right? In a long contest, sometimes these worlds go for 12 days, sometimes nationals go 7, 8, 9 days. If you screwed up yesterday or the day before and you let it bother you, it makes a huge difference on how you're going to fly today in terms of your mental outlook. There's a lot of examples of pilots doing it. The guy I like to quote on this one is Roger Federer, who was called in an article a good loser. I said, my God, you call him Roger Federer, the greatest of all time, a good loser? And the article's point was a good one, which is he doesn't seem to let failure bother him. He can really screw up in one tennis match and be just the same or better the next one. He doesn't carry it into the next match like he's got to make up for lost time or whatever. And I think all of us that have been racing have seen pilots do that, where they've done poorly the day before and they're twice as aggressive as they should be the next day because they seem to want to make up kind of have to leave it behind and stay positive. Is there any else?
Yep, there you go.
One more. This is me at the Swiss Nationals. True story. And it was in this beautiful bucolic place, much like Blairstown, with Swiss cows and bells on the barn next to them. And I would go over and pet the cow, and it really calmed me down. So, okay, that's all about getting ready. That's all about subtracting distractions and reducing the decision load. Now, how do you manage the decisions you just gotta make? Yeah, there's lots of ways to think about this. And so this is one that I've evolved, and I don't know that it works for everybody, or maybe not even right. I'd love to hear anybody's point of view here. There certainly are short-term, medium-term, and long-term, in time sense, decisions that you're dealing with. The short-term ones about this thermal, the medium-term about kind of where I go next, the long-term about where do I want to be down the road in ways. So it goes from sort of tactical to just strategic. But it's not like you make any of those and then leave them alone. You might make a strategic decision now and change it in 5 minutes or 3 minutes or whatever, because you see different development. You see gliders going one way that look like they're going a better way than you're going, whole bunches of factors. So it struck me that you kind of have to keep going through a process of thinking short, medium, and long. Tactical out to strategic. Tactical out to strategic, because again, it's an optimization sport. You're optimizing decisions, and even strategic decisions can get tweaked on a fairly routine basis in this sport. So what I kind of came up with is, what am I going to do in 3 seconds? 3 seconds is about the time you're going to tighten up your bank or loosen up your bank or watch out that somebody's going to hit you or whatever. So you're going to open your circle, close your circle, but optimize your thermal. And then after that, I think, what am I going to do in 30 seconds? Am I going to speed up or slow down? If I'm in the run, am I going to go faster or slower? Do I want to turn in this lift I just hit? Is it strong enough? Or is it something I should just blow by? Should I stay with this thermal or leave it? It's, it was 5 knots down below. It's 4.5 now. That's still pretty good. And, if it goes to 2 or whatever, I better get out of here. Should I be following some other competitor that seems to be ahead of me and doing well, or go my own way? That's kind of a 30-second. If you go further out, you're saying, what am I going to do in 3 minutes? This is more the end of the thermal kind of thinking, and the path outward in terms of harvesting an energy line. Remember, how you leave a thermal is really important. You just don't blast out of it, because they're never just cones. They always have tendrils and little wispies and stuff. And to the extent that you can deviate out under one of those, particularly on the upwind side, particularly on the side that you think is working, will make a big difference. Could be worth another turn in the thermal if you do it right. And so that saves you 30 seconds worth of thermal. And what do I see down the course? Can I see a nice cloud street like this where it's very obvious? That's usually not the case, certainly not in flatlands. There's a lot of markers, there's a lot of ways that you can play it. And so how do I want to work this? Do I want to go left, do I want to go right? And then further down the road, what am I going to do in 30 minutes? This is the really strategic stuff. Do I want to be way deeper into this zone? Do I want to turn around early and get back to the good weather that I just left? Are the clouds better or worse? Are the street lines developing? What's my next turn point? When will I have enough for final glide? So this 330 mantra is something that I sort of thought up and I don't always do it. I mean, I don't do it religiously. It just helps me think about short, medium, long, short, medium, long, short, medium, long, over and over again, so that I'm not so focused on the short or so focused on the long that I forget the other end of the spectrum and make a mistake there. And when you have a distraction, recognize that it's a distraction. I'll tell you, I have a great distraction story. I was running down somewhere in Minden with Eric Moser ahead of me. And I've always, I've had a sort of a personal battle with personal relief, right? So there's also all sorts of approaches that people have taken to deal with the needs of the body. let's call them. I did have the hose out the back, which promptly blew back into the back of the LS6 and corroded everything back there, so that was out. I had a variety of different approaches. I remember John Seymour saying that, you know, he used baggies, and when he was finished, he put an apple core in there, so when he threw it out the window, people would think it was apple juice. But this distraction was a good one. I was in the baggie mode at that time, so I had a baggie partially full on. It was bothering me. I didn't want it to pop, which has happened, and that's no fun. So I opened my side window and heaved it out. All of a sudden, the ship starts shuddering. Look over, and the thing has wrapped around the leading edge of the wing, about a foot out, with some above and some below, and it's fluttering. And so I think, oh my God, what do I do about this? I die, I climb, I roll, nothing. I think maybe I just stall into a tail saw. Or maybe I can reach out. No, I can't. I don't have the arms of a gorilla. Maybe I'll just open up the canopy. I don't know if you've ever opened up your canopy. It feels like it's when it gets sucked out. So I finally just ignored it and went to the next thermal where Eric, by now, is 1,000 feet above me. And as I was climbing up, good old air pressure dropped. The bag increased the volume, and all of a sudden it went boom, it disappeared. But anyway, those kind of distractions will just drive you absolutely crazy. You'll recognize when something isn't normal, obviously, it's just a distraction. But it's important to recognize what it is, get at it, fix it, and get on to the next thing right away. Keep this going the whole flight. And I guess that's my pitch. This is another reason not to ask Doug Jacobs to be your CD. That's Rick Rolke's ship. He went into a lake in Sugarbush, coming up that ridge behind him in weak weather. It was interesting to get him out of the lake because some farmer had the idea. He showed up with a couple of tractor tubes, all blown up. And Rick swam them out, put them under his wings, and the thing floated just enough so he could push it up onto the shore. It was great.
Did he fly the next day?
He did. Yeah, he dried it out and flew the next day. Reminds me all of Bob Fitch's great how you get a 126 out of the trees stories. You tie it up in the tree and you cut a 126 shaped hole in the forest. Anyway, so not to be off topic here, but that's kind of my pitch, is that decision making is really important. I think most often it's easy to get distracted with what kind of ship I have or other things like that. But I think the art of decision making and applying it to a pretty chaotic sport in a chaotic situation is really a very strong key to doing better, certainly as a racing pilot. To the extent that you can master a lot of this in this way or some similar way, I think you'll have a better time out there. Questions, comments, arguments? How are we doing on time?
6 minutes, 7 minutes.
To go.
Yep, you're doing great. Perfect.
I'm out of jokes, sorry. Yeah.
That is Chip, right?
Sort of, I recognize the outline of the head.
We're sort of about the same age. I've been frustrated the last few years because I'm not flying as well as I used to. And Daniel very kindly looked at some of my traces from Midlothian and came up with a long list of things I was doing wrong. And they all basically go back to I'm flying too conservatively. Are there things you've done as you've gotten older, other than buying a motor glider, to address that? I guess they
That'll calm your fears. I got
a natural tendency not to want to land out anymore. I can't recall the last time I went into a field. When I land out, maybe once a year, it's in an airport. It's different than it used to be.
Yeah.
And I'm unconsciously making all kinds of decisions, short and long term, to minimize the prospect of landing out. So as you got older, what have you done to try to address that, if anything?
I would say I'm subject to the same, call it improvement in my thinking. I mean, really. I think it's
I'm also flying crewless for a long time now.
some of the things we got away with in our younger days. So, as I say, I think that trade-off between aggressiveness and conservatism that shows up in age. It's kind of a natural phenomenon. And with more experience, particularly the bad experiences, it's natural to become more conservative. The other thing is, I think, how much you want it changes when you're new and coming in and you kind of want to make a reputation or get some stuff on your resume. You're more willing to be aggressive, where after a while you say, geez, I don't really, everybody knows who I am. I don't need to do anything different to impress anybody, or don't want to anyway. So I think it's a natural thing. But also, I guess beyond that basic answer, I think there's probably an embroidery on top of it that says, if you recognize it, it's like all these things, recognizing what the problem is or what the challenge is halfway to solving the problem. So if you feel like you're clearly being too conservative in certain circumstances, and it's safe to do so, or you can make it work with some inconvenience of a land out because there's fields, just recognize it and push forward. But I think it's natural. Anybody else? Well, thank you very much. This is fun.